Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Cornish. Today, I'm going to talk with you about the importance of the criminal justice system maintaining a criminal offender's constitutional rights. Using the Fourth Amendment as an example and showing the importance of why law enforcement, as an example, cannot violate a suspect's constitutional rights, even if they know that person's guilty. Now, first, we're going to talk about where the notion of a criminal offender having constitutional rights comes from, and that's due process. Now, due process, it's guaranteed in two clauses, in the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment, that no citizen shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now, what does that mean? What is due process? Well, it's the procedural guarantee that every citizen has that is accused of a crime, that they're entitled to rights specified by the United States Constitution and interpreted by the courts. So when we're talking about crime, we're talking about the Fourth Amendment, Fifth, Sixth, Eighth, and 14th. And we also have the notion of procedural due process, which basically that means the government, especially the criminal justice system, to include law enforcement, the criminal courts, and also corrections, that they have to follow specific procedures from when someone is first suspected of a crime and the criminal investigation starting, to them going into criminal court, to their conviction, clear through their punishment. These are rules that the criminal justice system has to follow to ensure that offender's constitutional rights are maintained. Now, per our Constitution, the Fifth and 14th Amendments, as well as interpretations by the court, anyone accused of a crime must be given certain rights and protections. And that specific procedures have to be followed. Law enforcement has procedures they have to follow. The criminal court has procedures they have to follow. Corrections has procedures that they have to follow to ensure an individual's constitutional rights are not violated. Now, an individual that is accused of a crime in our criminal justice system, they are legally innocent until proven guilty in court. Now, when it comes to procedural due process, law enforcement, their role when they're investigating crimes and they're turning the case over to the prosecution for trial to start, they have to treat the individual, even someone accused of committing a crime, justly and fairly. Now, the role of the court when it comes to due process and procedural justice is they have to ensure that the rights and protections of someone accused of crime are being maintained. So they're the check, making sure that everyone else is doing what they're supposed to. So the trial court is the check for the other parties in the trial process. They're also the check for law enforcement. The appellate court is a check for everybody below them. You know, they make sure that everyone is doing what they're supposed to and not violating that person's constitutional rights. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, they committed a crime. And especially if they're guilty, we know that they did it. Why do they have so many rights? The reason is to ensure that an innocent person is not wrongly convicted. That is one of the greatest travesties of the criminal justice system, is an innocent being wrongly convicted. The greatest travesty being an innocent being wrongfully executed for a crime that they actually didn't commit. And now we're going to go into the Fourth Amendment. Since we're going to be using that as an example, it's important for us to review what the Fourth Amendment is. Now, the Fourth Amendment protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures. which an unreasonable search and seizure is one in which there isn't a warrant issued by a judge and there isn't probable cause. Which probable cause, it's a level of proof necessary for arrests to be made, for warrants to be granted, in which a reasonable person giving the information would be able to tell a crime was committed or criminal activity had occurred or will be occurring. Now, there are numerous exceptions to the warrant and probable cause requirements of the Fourth Amendment, like incident to arrest searches, good faith, plain view, etc. And those are well established by the courts. Now, the trial court, in our example, if law enforcement does violate a suspect's constitutional rights, even if they outright know that that person's guilty, and they're just doing what they've got to do to make sure that that person's getting to trial and will be convicted, the court, being the ultimate check, will, if they realize that evidence was illegally obtained, they're going to deem it inadmissible at court. And that's the exclusionary rule, which comes from these cases that I have on the PowerPoint. Now, the exclusionary rule is the check for law enforcement as well as the prosecution, that if evidence is illegally obtained, either from a reasonable search and seizure or like a coerced confession, that it's not going to be allowed in court. And any evidence that came about from that illegally obtained evidence, that illegal search or that coerced confession, it's also inadmissible. So let's say law enforcement conducted an unreasonable search. They didn't have a warrant based on probable cause, or they lied, or they said an exception was in place when it really wasn't. Any evidence they obtained from that search, they won't be used in court. It can't be used in court. But then if they end up getting evidence later on from that search, if it was deemed unreasonable, that additional evidence also is inadmissible at court. And this could make or break a case. If you don't have enough evidence left after everything was deemed inadmissible, the case could end up getting dismissed by the judge. Or if there isn't enough evidence left for the jury to determine the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, then that person's going to get acquitted. So this is why it's very important for law enforcement to follow the Fourth Amendment and make sure that they're following what the Constitution says, that they're following case law. Is because if they breach the Fourth Amendment, it could end up resulting in the case getting dismissed, the defendant getting acquitted. Or if they do end up getting convicted, they could appeal the case and either get their conviction overturned, or they could get remanded for a new trial. But is it ethical for law enforcement to violate a suspect's constitutional rights when they outright know that they're guilty? There's no way around it. We're going to look at 3 theories to answer that question. Now, the first theory is utilitarianism. Which utilitarianism, it's in a group of theories that basically states that the means are justified by the end. That as long as you've got a good outcome, it doesn't matter how you did it. Now, with utilitarianism, it finds that actions are ethical if they bring the greatest amount of pleasure to the greatest number of people. So if you've got a large portion of, let's say, society that benefits from the action, it's going to be determined to be ethical. So how would utilitarianism address that question? would it be ethical for law enforcement when they know someone committed a crime to violate their Fourth Amendment rights? Basically to do what they got to do to get the evidence. Utilitarianism is going to view it mixed. It would say, yes, it's ethical because of the potential that offender, since they're guilty and they harm society, they're going to be removed from the streets. They're going to be potentially incarcerated. So it would be viewed as ethical. However, it wouldn't be, because if the trial court finds out that they violated the Fourth Amendment, that evidence is going to be deemed inadmissible. And any evidence derived as a result of that illegal search later is also going to be deemed admissible. So if you don't have enough evidence left, the defense is going to file to get the case dismissed. And most likely the judge will dismiss the case. And if they don't, and it ends up going to the jury to determine the verdict, there's a high chance that if there isn't enough evidence left for the jury to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, they're going to acquit the individual. Or if they are convicted, they could end up on appeal getting their conviction overturned, their case having to get a new trial. So, and with that, it's going to end up costing taxpayers money. Either with the investigation and the trial process, all that money was wasted because law enforcement violated the Fourth Amendment, or if on appeal the case gets remanded, then the public's got to pay for a new trial. But also that individual, whether the charges get dismissed, they are acquitted, or the conviction gets overturned, they're not being punished for the crime they committed that harmed society. And they're going to be able to commit additional crimes that are going to further hurt society. So with utilitarianism, ethical, yes and no. Now, the next theory we're going to look at is social justice, which is the reverse of utilitarianism. Social justice basically states, hey, it's fine and good, greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people, but we can't forget the little guy. We can't sacrifice the needs of the few to benefit the many. So how would social justice view this? Ethical or not ethical? Social justice theory would view law enforcement violating a suspect's constitutional rights, Fourth Amendment rights, even if they're guilty, as unethical, because they're violating that suspect's constitutional rights. And there is a chance that the suspect might be innocent. Yes, the evidence might be majorly pointing towards them, but it could be wrong. And also law enforcement, if they do that in one case where, we're positive this person's guilty, that they did it, they could end up continuing to do it and do it in cases where the suspect's actually innocent. So you're going to end up harming the few with this practice. Now, what about social contract theory? Would social contract theory view this scenario as ethical? Now, social contract theory, it's a binding agreement with society to avoid a state of nature, chaos where, the weak are being preyed upon, kind of like wild, wild west type things. Society agrees to give up some of their rights to govern themselves and authorizes a designated person or assembly to govern their actions. And the society agrees to abide by the authority of that designated person or assembly. So it's basically, we agree for the good of society to give up some of our rights to the designated assembly, which would be the government, especially the criminal justice system. And we agree that we're going to abide by their authority for the good of society. Now, as a designated assembly, which is the government or the criminal justice system, law enforcement's role as being a part of the designated assembly is they've got to investigate crime, arrest those who committed crime, ensure citizens are abiding by the law, and they also serve as a role model to the public. Now, under social contract theory, individuals that do commit crime, they're viewed as having breached their part of the social contract by committing a crime that harms society. So how would social contract theory view law enforcement violating an offender's constitutional rights, their Fourth Amendment rights, even if they're actually guilty? They outright know they're guilty. Social contract theory, just like utilitarianism, would view it mixed. First, it would be deemed ethical because law enforcement is ensuring that that criminal offender that violated their portion of the social contract by committing a crime that harms society is being punished. However, the theory would also view it as being unethical because law enforcement violated their own portion of the social contract as one of the designated assemblies. They violated a citizen's constitutional rights, as well as they're not abiding by the social contract. They're not abiding by the rules established, the Constitution, case law, statute. And they're also, by violating someone's constitutional rights and not doing what they're supposed to be doing as a designated assembly, they're also not being a role model to society. How can you enforce the social contract when you're not even following it? So all of these together, this is why law enforcement ensuring that they're not violating someone's constitutional rights is extremely important. Because of the fact that if they violate those rights, that individual could end up being set free. Either the case dismissed, acquitted, conviction overturned, and then they're not being punished. And they could be potentially committing additional crimes. As well as it's important that they're adhering to the Fourth Amendment and the other constitutional rights, because that person could actually be guilty. And if they're violating that person's constitutional rights, it could ultimately result in that person being wrongly convicted. Now, thank you for attending the presentation. I greatly appreciate it. I hope all of you have a good day, and thank you very much.